First, let's go to the first chart. All right. Uh, this is the gentleman sees two view graphs. What are we going to cover, and what are the answers to the questions we're raising? Uh, First, I mean, we're going to do. I'll explain why we're going to bother with history in a moment, but uh, history is going to be an important ingredient in trying to understand our present situation and to speculate about the future. And one of the key questions to understand the revolution that nuclear energy presents is, how was, what is city busting, and how was attacking cities viewed and done before and during World War II? Uh, Answering that helps explain why a very large explosive that could destroy large areas like a major city seemed super attractive and militarily and logically the very next kind of weapon we needed after we figured out how to do conventional bombing. Uh, so the nuclear weapons revolution is the next question. How was it first viewed? How did we think about it? I think it had a lot to do with city busting. What initially did developing ever larger nuclear weapons? Why did that seem logical? Well, because we wanted to destroy bigger cities, is the short answer. Uh, Precision guidance, came along. It's been underway, believe it or not, since World War One. How did its advent constitute a counter-revolution, and how has it affected nuclear weapons deployments? And then finally, do we really need to worry about city busting anymore or killing innocents? Is that morally or militarily an issue anymore? Let's get to the short answers. Uh, City busting was done before the Second World War. It was done poorly, and I would argue, at least in the beginning, somewhat reluctantly. During the Second World War, it was done brutally and enthusiastically. And afterward, we engaged in planning along those lines for quite a while. The revolution that nuclear weapons presented in that regard was basically an operational extension of what we were doing against Europe and Japan towards the end of the war, which was city busting. And bigger seemed better because you could destroy more portions of a major city. And so the race initially was to make these weapons more explosive and to understand the nuclear revolution from 45 through, roughly the late 50s and early 60s. That's what it was about. Uh, Precision guidance, which, as I mentioned, was something that we began toying with in some respects in the First World War, at least to have drone-like planes without pilots that could be guided. What got to the point at the end of the Second World War where we had actually TV guided bombs at the end of the Second World War. They were experimental, but they were used. But that kept those technologies of precision kept marching along, and by the 80s, both Russian and U.S. deployed forces declined precipitously because you were able to hit point targets with far less energy than our arsenals contained, and it was no longer seen as necessary to have as many or as big weapons as we had. And then, with regard to the morality and military utility of killing innocent people, we have more of a choice now because inaccuracies are no longer as prevalent for most of our weapon systems. Uh, and when things go badly, uh, I think there's still a temptation to kill innocents. And to some extent, the Russians' behavior in Ukraine suggests as much. Uh, and we'll talk more about that. So those are that you've just gotten the gentleman C version of the lecture. Why don't we get into it? Okay, let's just stop there. A brief comment on history. A lot of people, I should say, I teach occasionally at schools of, let's just say, uh, uh, they're not 1% schools. Please take that back down, if you could. Please, could you take that? Thank you. And I remember not that many, it was about 2 years ago, one student injected, when I asked about the Suez Crisis, these were graduate students in international relations. And I mentioned an analogy to the Suez Crisis of '56. And I said, can someone comment on, what that was all about? Total silence, followed by a comment, why do we need to know anything about 1956? That was before we were born. Well, I said I had to explain. I certainly hope we all understand. There are a lot of things that happened before we were even alive that both were remarkable in a positive way and uh, horrifying in a negative way. And our jobs, to the extent that we want to improve the world, or at least prevent the worst, is to be aware of those things and to try to understand to what extent they're possible in the future and how the current situation or future situations would either amplify or minimize those occasions or developments. And it isn't that history repeats itself perfectly. It isn't that it's an excellent guide to the future. It's just that it's all we have. We don't have anything else. And if you're not reading history, and if you're not curious about it, I don't think public service is where you should be. You should find something else to do. That's how strong a correlation there is between military science, public policy, and history. Just as a kind of a kicker on that regard, authorities, both good and evil, Churchill, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, the list could go on, were very, very emphatic that they would write the histories, because they understood that if you could explain where people had been and how they got there, you would be terribly convincing in persuading them about where to go. Lincoln also was of this view. All right, having said that, we are going to take a look at a little bit of history to try to understand what the nuclear revolution might have been about and what the morality of nuclear weapons use might be now and possibly in the future. To do that, we've got to understand where the idea of destroying city centers might have come from and how much sense it makes, um, at very least. And in this regard, what's interesting, now we can go to the next slide. If you go far enough back and you look for really smart people, and I think Mr. Sun Tzu is sort of in that category, um, you really get an ordering of military battles, or an order of battle, I should say, that represses or subordinates siege activity. I think we all are familiar with the first point, or have heard of it, and that is if you can subdue the enemy without fighting, by getting in their mind the notion that they're going to fail, then they won't lift an arm against you in the first place. That roughly, I suppose, is what we call deterrence. I mean, if you're really good at your strategy, you will deter the other adversary that you might have from doing anything harmful to you. You'll defeat them in their mind. That's a bloodless victory. If you want to know how the Chinese view what they want to do, to others, they understand this. They claim this is what they aspire towards the most. So that's, it still has a practical value to think about. The next is, of course, um, so it says, thus, what's of supreme importance in war is to attack the enemy's strategy. You can make it clear that your opponent's plans won't work; they won't execute them. The next, and this is probably more important than we understand even today, is if you can't do that, or to the extent that you can't do it as thoroughly as you want, you disrupt the friendships that they might have or military alliances by diplomacy and any number of other things. This is called information warfare, or at least it's an object of information warfare. Then the next best is to attack his army, which is pretty far down, and then at the very bottom, attacking cities. I think he got the order right, and this is still a tremendously useful guide, and probably the single richest paragraph in military thinking I've ever read. It bears rereading constantly. Um, in any case, historically, when you go read military scientists through the ages, you'll notice that most of them do not emphasize uh, siege, but instead, cities were plundered and besieged, uh, mostly as acts of revenge, desperation, brutality, or greed. I mean, it, most of the military writers don't tell you to, do that. At least most of them. I think the first significant modern example of targeting civilians in that was rationalized as military science, other than a tactic, was captured. It wasn't really spelled out in words, but it was captured by the thinking of General Sherman. Let's go to that. Yes. This is a remarkable piece of history, and sort of this. I'd like to think it's not a bad starting point for us in our studies. Um, a lot of people misunderstand what Mr. Sherman was about. I think if you're probably of Confederate persuasion, he's a monster, and I don't doubt that a lot of terrible things were done during the war, and by his hand. However, I think it's a misreading of what he was about, to just stop there. When he finally took uh, Atlanta, um, he ordered the residents to evacuate. In fact, he had a letter, which I just read this morning, to General Hood asking for his help in having an orderly evacuation and a division of labor. I mean, it was an extremely civilized letter, because he didn't want anyone to get hurt. It's not quite the way he's portrayed in sort of comic strip fashion by a lot of people. Um, they did burn down 30% of the city, but he avoided uh, churches, hospitals, and most of the residences. Instead, he focused on the rail system, stores that could assist the Confederacy, and the aim was to demoralize the Confederate military and to deprive them of the means to persist. Now, in his subsequent march to Savannah, by the way, a show of hands, anybody been to Savannah, Georgia? How many have? Well, there we go. Now, if you've been to Savannah, particularly the historical district, it's a really neat place. I mean, it's fascinating. And why is it? Well, it was untouched by the war. How'd that happen? Well, the mayor, when he saw Sherman coming and the Confederates tried to put up resistance, but did not succeed. Gave him the keys to the city. you know, he was no fool, and thank God he did. It is one of the most interesting places to visit I know of in America, and if you haven't done it, put it on your list. In any case, uh, Sherman during the march told his troops, "Do not go into anyone's homes, do not burn down their capital stock, take the crop, take the stores, take the livestock, but don't go any further unless they resist." I don't know how well his troops followed his directions, but that was the thought. Now, that is the beginning of thinking about attacking or unplugging the civil support of military activity. And it's very important, I think, to note how incredibly civilized it is compared to where we're going. Let's take a look at where we're going by going to the next slide.